In the spring of 1957, the people of Broken Ridge, Tennessee, gathered in the small wooden church on the hill for the funeral of Mary McCreary, a woman who had spent most of her life away from the town she was born into. The pews creaked beneath the weight of neighbors and distant kin, their whispers echoing like dry leaves scattered by the wind. But when the back doors opened and her daughter stepped in, silence fell heavy across the room. That was the first time anyone had laid eyes on Lillian McCreary in over a decade. Lillian was 27 years old, her frame hidden beneath a modest white dress, as though she had come not to bury a mother but to stand as a bride. The congregation stared at the contours of her face, marked by a severe craniofacial deformity that seemed to distort her features into unfamiliar angles. Her head tilted slightly to one side, her mouth drawn as if she had long since abandoned the effort of speaking. She kept her eyes down, and though many tried to meet her gaze, she offered none in return. Behind her walked Samuel McCreary, her older brother, a tall, broad man whose expression carried both warning and authority. His hand pressed lightly against Lillian's back, as though guiding her, or perhaps restraining her. It was his presence that silenced further questions. The town had long accepted that Samuel rarely allowed his sister to step beyond the fences of their farm at the edge of the valley. To see her here in the open was a rupture in the veil that had covered their lives. Whispers spread quickly. Why had she been hidden? Why was she dressed like a bride for her own mother's funeral? The silence surrounding the McCreary family had been tolerated for years, dismissed as the oddities of mountain folk who preferred solitude. But that day, suspicion began to take root. When the service ended, Lillian lingered near the coffin, her hands folded neatly before her, the white fabric of her dress brushing against the wooden floorboards. Samuel leaned down, whispering into her ear. She did not reply, only blinked slowly, her lips pressed tight, her shoulders drawn inward. Then, with a nod from her brother, she left as quietly as she had come, vanishing again into the folds of Broken Ridge. For the people of the town, the memory of her presence lingered longer than the burial itself. They would return to their homes unsettled, whispering over supper tables and in dim-lit kitchens about the silent young woman who seemed both ghostly and imprisoned, a bride without vows. It was only much later, when strange rumors began to circulate about infants no one had ever seen, that they remembered that day, the day she first appeared in white at her mother's funeral. At first, the whispers were faint, spoken in corners where lanterns burned low and curtains were drawn against the night. Families in Broken Ridge began to murmur of babies heard crying in the distance but never seen, of Samuel making hurried trips to the old graveyard under moonlight, carrying bundles wrapped too tightly for anyone to mistake. The community, bound by its instinct to look away from the odd and unsettling, tried to dismiss these suspicions. Yet the image of Lillian in white, her silence, her lowered eyes, made denial harder with each passing week. A neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, recalled seeing Samuel's lantern flicker in the pasture after midnight, a pale figure at his side. She swore the woman with him was Lillian, her dress dragging in the dirt, her face turned away. Others remembered the brief appearance of tiny headstones at the far edge of the cemetery, unmarked and soon swallowed by grass. It was not in the nature of the town to intervene quickly. Mountain folk held to their own affairs, believing each family had the right to its secrets. But still, unease began to ferment. The unspoken question weighed heavily. Who were these children, and why did no record of their existence appear in the church ledger or county books? For Lillian, glimpses were rare. She was seen only once again, months later, standing by the fence of the McCreary farm. A group of children from the valley had been chasing a ball when they stumbled near the property. They stopped short when they saw her. hands gripping the wooden posts so tightly her knuckles seemed white against the weathered wood. She did not speak, but one boy swore that her lips moved silently, as if trying to form words too long denied. The children ran, carrying with them the eerie certainty that she had tried to ask for help. Inside the farmhouse, Samuel was said to rule with unyielding control. Visitors were rare and discouraged. When the county taxman came, Samuel met him at the gate, never allowing him to step onto the porch. He signed papers with a steady hand, his expression revealing nothing. And yet, behind the closed shutters, townsfolk imagined the presence of children, cries muffled, small feet never allowed to walk freely in daylight. The silence around Lillian became unbearable to some. A school teacher in town began pressing questions, asking why a woman her age had never been seen attending service, why no doctor had visited their home despite talk of illness and childbirth. The townsfolk, caught between fear of Samuel and pity for his sister, wavered in their willingness to speak aloud, but the rumors only thickened, growing into a cloud too heavy to ignore. And slowly, Broken Ridge began to watch the McCreary farm with sharper eyes. The whispers that once drifted softly now carried weight, each rumor stitched together by fragments of sightings and uneasy confessions. A county clerk, sorting through old records, noted that while marriages and deaths of the McCreary family were dutifully entered, no births were ever recorded after Lillian's childhood. And yet, by then, too many had heard of faint cries in the night or seen Samuel carrying parcels across the fields under the cover of shadows. One of the oldest residents, Elias Brewer, recalled a memory from years earlier, long before Mary McCreary's death. He claimed that while hunting near the ridge, he had stumbled upon Samuel kneeling in the earth, digging with a spade by lantern light. Elias swore that the bundle beside him was small enough to be a swaddled child. At the time, he said nothing, believing it was not his place. But now, with the town uneasy, his recollection came rushing back, shared in hushed tones at the general store. The more people looked, the more uneasy details emerged. A doctor from a neighboring county remembered being summoned once, late at night, by a frantic voice on the telephone. When he arrived at the McCreary property, Samuel met him at the gate and told him his services were no longer needed. Behind the curtains of the house, he thought he saw a pale hand clutching at the window frame before vanishing. That doctor never returned, but the image stayed with him, haunting his thoughts when news of Lillian resurfaced. What unsettled people most was not only the suspicion of hidden births, but the fact that Lillian herself seemed locked in a silence too complete, too suffocating, as if her voice had been taken from her. To some, she appeared almost spectral, bound in her brother's orbit, unable to step beyond it. To others, her silence carried the weight of secrets too unbearable to speak. Local historian Clara Withers later reflected on the case, noting how isolation had long defined the mountains. When families cut themselves off, their stories become shadows, she wrote in her journal. And sometimes, in those shadows, lives vanish before they are ever named. Her words captured the unease that hovered over Broken Ridge, a sense that entire lives might have begun and ended within the McCreary farmhouse, unseen and unrecorded. Still, despite the growing suspicion, few dared confront Samuel directly. He moved through town with quiet confidence, purchasing supplies, collecting tools, never lingering long enough for questions. His eyes, sharp and unflinching, seemed to warn anyone who thought of prying. And so, while voices grew louder in kitchens and barns, the silence at the McCreary farm remained intact, guarded by fear and habit. But the fragile wall of secrecy was beginning to crack, and what lay behind it threatened to shatter the valley's peace forever. The first breach came from a stranger, not a neighbor. In 1959, a census worker, making his slow rounds through the hollows and valleys of Tennessee, arrived at the McCreary farm. He expected little more than names and ages, a signature scrawled across his form. Instead, he found himself standing at the edge of the porch, Samuel blocking the doorway with a forceful presence. Behind him, the faint cry of a child pierced through the stale air, then stopped abruptly as if smothered by silence. The census worker pressed, asking how many lived in the home. Samuel's jaw tightened. He gave the names of himself and Lillian, no others. When asked about children, his reply was cold. "There are none." The worker wrote it down, uneasy, knowing what he had heard. Yet the record he filed contained no trace of doubt. 2 residents only, the line beneath left blank. It was that same year when townsfolk noticed 3 new graves, shallow and unmarked, appearing at the far reaches of the cemetery. Rumor spread that they belonged to the McCrearys, though no minister had been called, no ceremony held. Children playing near the edge of the grounds whispered that they had seen Samuel digging in the night, his lantern glowing dim in the fog. One swore that Lillian stood nearby, her white dress dirty, her hands trembling as if she wished to interfere but could not. Yet for all the murmurs, the truth seemed slippery, shifting with each retelling. Some insisted the graves held stillborn infants. Others believed they were nothing more than animal burials. With the town's imagination running wild, the false comfort of doubt offered people a reason to look away, to avoid stepping into the storm that loomed. In a later account, Deputy Carter admitted he had been urged to investigate, but chose not to. "We had nothing solid," he recalled. "Rumor ain't law, and Samuel was a man not to be crossed." His words revealed not only fear, but a dangerous willingness to allow shadows to thicken, so long as they remained convenient. But a single event would later prove that the doubts had only protected the guilty. A school child claimed to have seen a baby's bonnet snagged on the wire fence of the McCreary property, spotted with dirt and something darker. The boy told his mother, who hushed him, warning never to speak of it again. The fragile stories of graves, cries, and vanished infants might have faded as another tale of mountain superstition. But the silence of Lillian, paired with the watchful cruelty of Samuel, refused to let Broken Ridge rest. The facade was unraveling, and the truth pressed closer, demanding to be seen. The breaking point arrived in 1960, when a young doctor newly assigned to the county was called unexpectedly to a farmhouse on the outskirts of Broken Ridge. He later testified that the call had come from a trembling voice he believed belonged to Lillian. When he arrived, Samuel stood at the door, his expression harsh, but the urgency of the situation forced him to let the man inside. The doctor entered a dim, suffocating room where the air smelled of blood and damp earth. On a bed pushed against the wall lay Lillian, pale and silent, her body weakened from what was unmistakably childbirth. She clutched a small bundle to her chest, refusing to release it even as tears tracked across her face. The doctor, shaken, asked Samuel where the child was to be taken for care. Samuel's reply was chilling in its simplicity: "There is no child." Moments later, the bundle was gone. The doctor never saw where Samuel carried it. When he tried to protest, Lillian reached for his wrist, her grip frail but desperate, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak. No sound came. Her silence was more haunting than words could have ever been. The doctor's account, once shared with county officials, shook the valley. He described the condition of Lillian's body, the unmistakable signs of repeated childbirth, and the fresh evidence of yet another infant who had been born into shadows. He spoke of the farmhouse as if it were a prison, shuttered and suffocating, where life began only to vanish. For the townsfolk, this was confirmation of their darkest suspicions. Rumors hardened into conviction. Mothers in the valley whispered prayers for the unnamed children, while fathers spoke in anger, debating whether Samuel should be confronted directly. Yet fear still kept them tethered, for Samuel's presence had long carried an air of menace, and no one wished to be the one to provoke him. The sheriff, urged by townspeople, reluctantly opened an inquiry, though his steps were slow and his words cautious. He admitted to colleagues that he feared what would happen if he forced his way into the McCreary home. And yet the story had already escaped the valley's grip, drawing attention from officials beyond Broken Ridge. It was this testimony, the trembling recollection of a doctor who had witnessed Lillian's suffering firsthand, that marked a turning point. No longer could the silence be dismissed as mere mountain lore. It became evidence, raw and undeniable, that something unspeakable was taking place within the McCreary farmhouse. For those who had carried suspicion but lacked proof, it was a grim validation. The truth had begun to slip through the cracks of silence, and once revealed, it could not be hidden again. By 1961, whispers had turned to accusations. Neighbors no longer looked away when passing Samuel in town. They watched him closely, their gazes sharp, their silence heavy with condemnation. Still, no one dared to act openly. Fear clung to Broken Ridge like fog, and Samuel's shadow loomed large. Then came the discovery that struck the valley cold. A farmer repairing a fence along the ridge stumbled across a bundle buried shallow beneath the soil. Inside lay the remains of a child, wrapped in faded cloth, no more than a few weeks old when life had ended. The farmer dropped his tools and ran to the sheriff, his voice shaking as he recounted what he had seen. The sheriff, forced to act, sent men to the McCreary property. They found nothing inside the house, no crib, no signs of children, just the silence of shuttered rooms and the fixed stare of Samuel, who denied everything. But in the barn, beneath loose boards in the floor, they uncovered more small bundles, each carefully wrapped, each concealing what the valley had long feared. Lillian was found there too, sitting in the corner of the barn, her white dress streaked with dust, her hands resting limp in her lap. When the deputies approached, she did not resist. Her lips parted, her eyes glistened with a longing to speak, but no sound left her. She seemed both prisoner and witness, her silence more damning than any confession. The remains were carried out in silence, and the valley wept in quiet shock. Mothers held their children closer, while men muttered curses under their breath, torn between outrage and dread of what Samuel might do in retaliation. For the first time, Broken Ridge could not deny the horror that had taken place within their own land. It was then that a psychiatrist brought from Nashville to examine Lillian spoke to the press. He described her as a woman trapped in a state of profound coercion, her life reduced to obedience, her will silenced by years of domination. He explained her muteness not as a defect of the body, but as the scar of relentless control. His words painted her not as complicit, but as a victim ensnared in the grip of her brother's will. The townsfolk who had once viewed her with suspicion now saw her differently. They remembered her lowered eyes, her trembling hands, her silent plea at the fence. Pity mixed with horror, and questions grew louder. How many children had lived only to vanish? How many graves lay hidden in the soil of Broken Ridge? The valley could not turn back. What had been unearthed demanded answers, and the silence of the McCreary farm was no longer enough to contain it. When investigators pressed deeper, they sought not only evidence in the barn, but records that might explain the breadth of what had been concealed. Old county archives were pulled, dusty ledgers examined, and midwives interviewed. What surfaced shocked even the most skeptical. A retired nurse confessed that years earlier she had been asked, in hushed desperation, to attend to a frail woman in labor at the edge of Broken Ridge. She remembered Lillian, pale, trembling, her body marked by exhaustion from too many pregnancies. She claimed Samuel had stood over her the entire time, forbidding her to write any names or issue certificates. When pressed about the baby, the nurse admitted she had heard its cry but never saw where it was taken. This testimony strengthened what had already begun to unravel, a story of lives denied acknowledgement, snuffed out before the world even recognized them. The authorities grew bolder. Deputies escorted Samuel into custody, though his arrest was marked by eerie calm. He neither resisted nor spoke in his defense, his silence almost daring the valley to judge him without confession. Lillian, meanwhile, was placed in the care of social workers. Witnesses described her as a figure of haunting fragility, her hands always folded in her lap, her eyes flickering with fear whenever a man entered the room. Though she would not speak, her gestures told their own story. Once, when handed a doll by a nurse, she held it close with trembling arms, rocking gently until tears streaked her face. The psychiatrist who had already spoken of her returned to expand on his findings. He described a condition rooted not in madness but in trauma. She has lived under enforced obedience for so long that silence became her survival. Her muteness is not illness, it is endurance. His statement reframed the valley's perception of her, transforming the silent bride into a woman crushed by years of domination. Still, the case was clouded by contradictions. Some in town clung to denial, suggesting that the graves found in the barn might have been old animal burials, or that the doctor had exaggerated his account. Others whispered that the county was eager to create a scandal, using the McCreary name as spectacle. These false leads lingered like fog, but with every testimony the truth pressed harder against the surface. At Samuel's first hearing, the courthouse was packed. Farmers, mothers, townsfolk who had once turned away, all sat in silence as the prosecutor read aloud the evidence. The unmarked graves, the testimonies of the doctor and nurse, the physical toll on Lillian's body. No one looked at Samuel without unease. No one left that room unchanged. The trial had begun, but for the people of Broken Ridge, the true judgment was already unfolding in their hearts. The courthouse in rural Tennessee had never seen such a crowd. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of neighbors and strangers alike, all drawn by the dark spectacle of the McCreary case. The air smelled of damp wool and nervous sweat as Samuel was led to his seat, iron chains clinking faintly at his wrists. His face betrayed no fear, no regret, only the same cold watchfulness that had long kept the valley silent. The prosecutor laid out the case piece by piece, the remains found beneath the barn, the doctor's sworn testimony, the nurse's recollection, the unrecorded pregnancies etched into Lillian's body like scars. Each detail was a knife turning in the valley's conscience. The defense, however, argued that there was no definitive proof the remains were human, no official records tying Samuel to any act of wrongdoing. They painted the townsfolk as gossips, their grief and fear exaggerating shadows into crimes. It was in this tension that the testimony of a social worker shifted the course. Assigned to care for Lillian after Samuel's arrest, she described in aching detail the woman's condition. Her hands raw from years of labor, her body bearing the signs of repeated, hidden maternity, her silence broken only by trembling gestures. "She is not mad," the worker insisted before the jury. "She is a woman who has been forced to carry more than any person should bear, with no voice to release it." The room was silent as her words sank in, heavy and undeniable. For the people of Broken Ridge, the trial became less about Samuel's guilt and more about their own. How many had seen the signs and looked away? How many had heard the cries at night but buried the memory in fear? The valley itself seemed to stand accused, complicit in the silence that had swallowed so many lives. Yet when the verdict came, it was not as clear as the crowd expected. Samuel was found guilty of unlawful concealment of remains, but not of murder, the absence of definitive records leaving the court hesitant to declare full responsibility. His sentence was years, not life. For some, it felt like justice betrayed. For others, it was more than they had ever believed possible, that Samuel McCreary, the untouchable shadow of the valley, was finally caged. Outside the courthouse, people lingered long after the verdict, their voices low, their faces pale. Mothers clutched their children, fathers shook their heads, and the silent figure of Lillian was escorted away once more, her fate uncertain but her presence unforgettable. The trial had ended, but the haunting of Broken Ridge was only beginning. After the gavel fell and Samuel was led away in chains, the people of Broken Ridge did not find relief. Instead, an unease settled over the valley like a fog that refused to lift. The verdict had been spoken, but the unanswered questions lingered, festering in the silence Samuel left behind. How many children had lived and died without a name? Were their graves hidden beyond those discovered in the barn? And most pressing of all, what would become of Lillian, the silent bride whose presence had both unsettled and broken their hearts? Placed under the care of the state, Lillian was transferred to a home for women in Nashville. Reports filtered back in whispers. She rarely spoke, her silence unbroken except for the faintest of sounds in her sleep. Nurses described her as folding scraps of cloth into small bundles, cradling them as if they were infants. Once, a caretaker found her in the garden at dusk, digging into the dirt with her bare hands, tears streaming down her face. A geneticist who examined her case suggested that her repeated, hidden pregnancies and the deformities of her face told a story written into the bloodline itself, a cycle of isolation that had turned inward upon itself. He warned that Broken Ridge was not unique, that other mountain valleys bore similar scars, where families hidden away for generations carried both physical and psychological burdens. His words unsettled the public, painting the McCreary tragedy as part of a broader tapestry of silence across rural America. For the townsfolk, guilt became its own sentence. Families who had once traded with Samuel now wondered if their silence had enabled him. Men who had seen the lantern light near the cemetery remembered turning away. Mothers who had hushed their children's questions now wept, knowing the stories were true. The haunting was not only the memory of unnamed children, it was the realization that an entire community had chosen blindness. When Samuel died in prison in 1963, the news spread quickly. Some felt a grim satisfaction, others only emptiness. No death could restore what had been lost. No sentence could measure the weight of lives erased before they could begin. Lillian remained in care until her own death years later, never taking another step beyond the walls of institutions. In Broken Ridge, her story lived on as both warning and wound, a tale spoken in whispers to children who grew up asking why the farm at the edge of the valley stood empty. The haunting of Broken Ridge was not in the trial nor in Samuel's prison cell. It was in the silence that remained, a silence that could never fully be broken. Years passed, and the McCreary farmhouse stood abandoned at the edge of Broken Ridge, its windows shattered by storms, its boards warped with rot. Grass grew waist-high around the porch where Samuel once stood guard, and vines crept across the siding as if nature itself sought to reclaim the place. Yet even in ruin, the house held a weight, an air of dread that kept children from playing near it and hunters from crossing its fields. Those who dared approach told of strange sensations, the stillness of the air, the way sound seemed to die before reaching the door, the faint creak of floorboards when no one was inside. The barn, where the most terrible discoveries had been made, collapsed slowly into the earth, its roof sagging until it caved. Locals said the ground there felt colder, as though the soil remembered what had been hidden beneath. The cemetery, too, bore its scars. The unmarked graves remained, their locations whispered from parent to child but never recorded. Wildflowers grew thickest over those spots, as if trying to shield them from sight. On certain nights, townsfolk claimed to hear a woman's soft weeping carried on the wind, though no one could ever say from where it came. For historians and journalists who later came to document the case, the McCreary story was not just one of cruelty, but of silence. The silence of a valley that had watched, suspected, and yet chosen not to intervene until it was too late. It became a cautionary tale, retold in lectures and articles, reminding others that secrecy can be as destructive as violence. Yet within Broken Ridge itself, the memory remained more intimate, more haunting. Elderly residents recalled the day Lillian appeared in white at her mother's funeral. Her eyes cast down, her voice locked away. Younger generations grew up hearing fragments pieced together like a broken song, always ending with the same chilling image: the silent bride who carried lives that never lived to see the light. When Lillian herself passed away, far from the ridge in an institution that had sheltered her final years, her burial was simple and unmarked. The state gave her no headstone, no epitaph. But in Broken Ridge, her name lingered like a ghost, whispered in kitchens, murmured at church steps, invoked whenever silence in a family seemed too heavy to be harmless. The farmhouse eventually collapsed in a storm, its remains scattered across the field. Yet the land never shed its reputation. Travelers passing through felt an inexplicable unease, a weight they could not name. For the people of Broken Ridge, they needed no explanation. They knew the silence had never left. It clung to the valley, a reminder of lives erased, of voices that were never allowed to speak. And in the ruins of the McCreary farm, the silence endured, heavier than stone, deeper than earth, eternal as the ridge itself.